welcome to the Sex, Gender, and Health plenary session. My name is Nicole Perry, or Dr. Nicole Perry. I teach primarily at the Skokie campus, so those of you that are primarily here at the Des Plaines campus might not recognize my face. But I'm in the biology department and teach mostly anatomy and physiology classes. And as one of my interests, and it's been one of my interests for a long time, has been reproductive medicine and how women and men experience different diseases. And so it kind of ties into what I do in the classroom, and as a part of that, I decided to invite a couple of speakers here today for the Women and Genders Study Conference. So we have two speakers on a panel that are going to talk about women and men and how they experience different diseases and some of the research that's going on in terms of those different experiences. And so as soon as we get these last few people coming in who ate their bagels late, we'll get started with our panel discussion. So we have two speakers, both from Northwestern University, sharing what they study and what they do for a living with us today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perry. What a pleasure it is to be here at Oakton Community College. It's a beautiful campus, and I've become more familiar with your curriculum, and so I'm very impressed by what you are studying. And I really like this topic of futuristic feminism. It's a great one, and the fact that there's gendered and sex differences in science and medicine as part of your discussion is really something that I applaud. I also know that we are going up against a terrific plenary speaker who I think is maybe constructing new feminist rap right now. So I'm delighted that all of you decided to join us in this panel because that I'm sure is a very exciting topic. This is a panel discussion, and so I'm just going to preface my remarks by saying I just brought a few slides. I couldn't help but bring maybe 10 slides just to provide fodder for your thinking. I know the majority of our time will be spent asking and answering questions together, but I thought I'd bring some framing documents that would allow us to maybe start from a similar starting point, and then I'll turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, for some additional remarks, and then we'll conclude with your questions. So I've titled this a little bit, Translation in Multiple Dimensions, and Dr. Perry started out by indicating what I think all of us share, is that reproductive health really influences an overall lifetime of health. And my particular prism has always been from the perspective of women's health, but I do think that sex and gender basis of health and disease influences all of us, males and females. And so I would draw this arc even more broadly that reproductive health is really important for an overall lifetime of health in both sexes. We have to recognize where we are and where this stands kind of politically as well. And certainly most folks would say, well, why are we really thinking about sex and gender basis of health and disease when we really have colliding epidemics of obesity and diabetes that are really the tsunami that is overcoming much of our nation? If you look at the demographics of obesity, almost all the states are red, and that's not politically speaking. That is the CDC color for greater than 50% of the population having a BMI that is consistent with obesity. If we now overlay that data with the pediatric obesity, we start to see an even more grim reality, which is that there are about a dozen states that now are red for pediatric obesity. And that's something that has happened in the last 4 years. So similar to global climate change, we're really seeing a global, or at least a domestic, body change that's associated with obesity and the associated comorbidities of diabetes and other health indices. So you can say, well, why are we really thinking about reproductive health or sex and gender basis of health and disease when we have these big issues that are facing us? We have the silent killers of infectious diseases that we think of as something that's somewhere off in a distant shore. And that's not the case. Infectious diseases kill more Americans every year than cardiovascular disease. And it has a particularly profound impact on sexual health. And again, something we sometimes think of as, well, that's some other third or second world concern, but in fact that is a concern of ours. There also is an enormous pressure on our healthcare system. The political dialogue about the Affordable Care Act, which really probably influences almost everyone in this room in a direct way, is part of a political football. And so how do we imagine the Affordable Care Act as it influences and advances sex and gender health care? So for the first time, rape kits are now covered under the ACA. That's something that is an important part of that initiative. There are contraceptive access points that are part of ACA. That's an important part of that initiative and really speaks to part of the political landscape that we didn't have these in the past. And then of course there's the uneven distribution of care. How is it that we can provide care across the socioeconomic continuum and make sure that all of us have the best access that we can to the most modern medicine and technology in a way that doesn't break the bank. So these are this is the cauldron in which our topic necessarily must sit. And even though these seem like somewhat intractable topics, I do think this is a time of tremendous potential. And part of that is because I look out at all of you and those that I teach at Northwestern and throughout the Chicago public schools in our many high school academy programs. And I think all of you represent that potential to make sure that the next generation of healthcare really does involve itself in the fundamental problems of sex differences health. And as I'll lay out in my arguments, I think that if we do that right, we will save ourselves money and as a consequence, and also make ourselves healthier. And so I do think that this topic is important to both sexes. Sometimes when we think about sex bases of health and disease, we really do think about women. But I think if we can understand the differences, and it's not a pejorative to say that we are different, it simply says that there are physiological truths to the differences in our anatomy and our physiology. I think we can do better on behalf of all people. So let me frame the panel discussion today in terms of a hypothesis and see at the end of kind of the next hour we can decide if we can advance this hypothesis in a specific way. I'm going to argue that advances in 21st century medicine really requires a fundamental knowledge of sex differences at the molecular, at the cellular, and at physiological levels to ensure that best practices, that's best medical practices, best socioeconomic practices, best living practices are developed for all people. And I think if you imagine sex differences, you might already have thought of chromosomal differences. So X and Y represent part of that molecular difference. Cellular differences, though, are influenced by the X and Y chromosome, not only in the cellular functions associated with the reproductive tract, but in fact with all the cells of the body. There are sex differences in eye health, and skin health, and cardiovascular health, and kidney health, and liver health, and skin health. All of these areas are cells responding idiosyncratically to the molecular signals that are expressed by the chromosomal sex of those particular cells. And then the physiological level, of course, we think of the hormone differences. They all stem from the chromosomal sex, but it is that levels of these hormones then drive the biology of individuals. And so each of these levels need to be part of our thought process, even as sometimes we think solely about chromosomal sex or solely about the menstrual cycle. And all of these levels are important for both males and for females. So let me give you some examples of some sex and gender disparities and some obstacles and perhaps some examples of success. And again, I present these today not as kind of the entire spectrum, but as kind of a straw man for us to think about as you're considering your questions for discussion during this panel discussion. So let's start with something I think many of you, particularly those in Dr. Perry's class, are well aware of, arteriosclerosis. It is true that arterial plaques form differently in males and females. And I also want to say at this point that they change with age. So the What happens in a male at 30 versus a male at 60 differs, and what happens in a female at 30 and a female at 60. And so we really, as a healthcare community, have to think about the continuum of age imposed on sex as part of our, as a part of advancing medicine. So they develop differently in men and women. And existing diagnostics, however, are more effective for detection in males, and that's primarily because we've thought of large vessels as the site for most of the plaques that then cause pathology. But in fact, in females, many of the plaques form in the small vessels, and our imaging technology is not set up to be able to analyze those small vessels. And that then provides a discordance in how we're able to detect and make early diagnostics for arthrosclerotic diseases. Joint replacements, the gendered knees, that were described a couple of years ago. Knees were really something where we've been able to, knees and hips, been able to create replacement parts. And any of you have an elderly family member may have had a hip or a knee replacement, and we're getting much better as a scientific and medical community of replacing joint function. But for many years, the knees were not made to scale, so they were made for larger frames rather than smaller frames, and the articulation of the knees were wider apart. And so women would have the knees replaced, but they would have higher incidence of pain and less mobility associated with just the frank difference in the biomechanics of the joints that were being replaced. And so that's an area that could be changed. And then the last one, which is a true gender difference, so we went from sex to kind of sex gender, now to gender, kind of in the identification of who we are. So the budget cuts in the 90s led to the discontinuation of the spacesuits that were necessary for the frames of women to go into spacewalks. And so this was a budgetary decision, but it also eliminated the possibility that women in the workforce, the workforce at NASA, could ever aspire to being one of those who goes into space. So this was something that many in the field started to argue against, and eventually, of course, NASA's budget was really cut, and so there's not much less to really argue. So on the first topic, which is really one that could be fundamentally solved by basic science, moving new ideas into clinical medicine, we really had a gap in that historically the research community assumed that beyond the reproductive system, differences did not really exist, or weren't, if they did, they really weren't relevant. So we really had a bottle gap really from the fundamental bench scientists who would say, well, it's important for me to study peripheral vascular disease, but if I study it in males and females, that's just duplicating my effort, and it's double the price. And in fact, these female animals, I have all this variation or error in my data, and beyond that, it's just too hard to deal with female mice. Well, you can see that all those arguments, it's very easy for me to argue against. So every time those come up, I can say, well, you're not really duplicating your effort, because in fact that error that you say exists within the female colonies when you finally decide to test that really might be the underlying physiology of the female versus the male. And so you're missing that key difference that might make that drug that you're testing more efficacious as it moves down the pipeline ultimately towards clinical trials. I have a very specific example of that, of a peripheral vascular drug that was under development and in fact utilized clinically around the nation. And a clinician at Northwestern was studying that, the effectiveness of this peripheral vascular drug in a diabetic animal model. She's a good friend of mine, so she was telling me all about the outcomes of some of the research she was doing. I said, well, that's really interesting. So what happens in the female mice? And so she gave me these 4 arguments. So about the time she got to her 3rd and a half argument, I had choked her sufficiently so she was present. She was hypoxic on the floor. And so by the time I let her back up from under the floor, she had agreed that it was really important for her to study what was happening in the female animals. And so she said, well, I just don't really know how to deal with this cycle thing. And, again, I just put my finger very close to her carotid, and she said, but I'm going to learn. And so she did a study on female animals and came running into my office about 2 years ago saying, I can't believe it, but this is a drug that I prescribe clinically every day. And what I found is that the drug is perfectly efficacious in the males, just what I always expected. But in fact, in the females, I do not have any efficacy of this peripheral vascular drug. And she said that means that half of the people that I treat are not getting the benefit of this drug. So that's a perfect example of, first of all, coercion in science really works. So that's A. But B, it says that, we have our biases about whether or not we should even be doing the work. And what I would argue is the best place to do sex differences analysis is at the bench, when it's far less expensive to get the answers we need before we move all the way up the pipeline to clinical trials. And it's less expensive if we can figure out adverse events back at the bench and have kind of a peek under the tent before we get to clinical trials. And I think it's just better medicine if we know what is useful in what population. It is not necessary that every drug that's developed ultimately be used for every single part of our population. And in fact, that's the conceit of this notion of personalized medicine. That in fact, we can tailor our drugs for individuals. And so what I say to that is before we get to personalized medicine, we have to at least cut the population in half and look at males and females. And if we do that, drugs that are effective for male will be used. And guess what? I'll bet down in that pipeline of discovery for that peripheral vascular drug that ultimately was approved and was used for males and females, if they went back in their pipeline and looked for other molecules, I'll bet they would find one that was efficacious for females. And that would actually be in the best interest of the health of the nation, and it would help the bottom line of that pharmaceutical department, or pharmaceutical company. So that's an example of where the research community has some blinders, and what we need to do is make sure we communicate where there are necessary steps that they can take and how invaluable that is ultimately along the way. I think many of you also know that women have been excluded historically from clinical trials, primarily because of the possibility of pregnancy. So the safety and efficacy of these drugs haven't been studied during the lifetime when many women are taking drugs. And so that is something that has to be wrestled with at the regulatory level. And so we've been very articulate, I hope, in saying that women want to be a part of these clinical studies because it impacts us and our families. And to say that we should be excluded because we happen to be within an age range of 20 to 45 doesn't make sense on behalf of, again, our health and the health of our family members. And then finally, on this idea of the cost and duplication and this variation in the data as really big concerns, I think I've already outlined for you a little bit of my argument, which is that I think it's less costly to do the work at the bench. You're not duplicating physiology when you're looking at males and females. And that variability really probably represents underlying physiology. Now, not all drugs and not all processes are going to have a sexual dimorphic feature. So in fact, if you could show that at the bench when you get to those clinical trials, it's going to be a lot easier because you don't have to worry about that part of the equation. But again, if you do have a sex difference, you can more quickly laser in on drugs that are effective in certain populations. Now, some of you might say, who are coming to this talk today, that, well, you really thought we were doing better, that, in fact, we had kind of this notion that there are sex differences that matter in cardiovascular disease or peripheral vascular disease, as I just described. So what's going on? Well, it turns out that even though we kind of know this as an important area of work, no significant differences in the percent of women in non-sex specific studies have been reported from 2004 to 2009. In fact, we dipped from 43% down to 38%. And 64% of the study didn't report any outcomes based on sex. And so sex-specific analysis in the best literature of the land still remains very low. So what about animal research? And this is, again, my argument on the basic science. Well, it turns out that only 32% of the studies published in neuroscience journals, and endocrinology and physiology, pharmacology, reported the sex of the experimental animal. This, I think, is absolutely crazy and not a good part of the scientific method. And I just provide for you here one analysis of the cardiovascular literature. This is a place that we've known since 1992, that the presentation of cardiovascular disease in males and females differs. This is where the large and small vessels really come into play. Women were coming into the emergency room and complaining of chest pains, and they were being sent home because the imaging diagnostics wouldn't show any occlusion in the major vessels. And they'd go home and they would die, and that's because the small vessels were included. So that's actually the sex differences, the anatomy of the plaques and the way they presented. There was also a gender difference in the way those women presented in emergency rooms. And it was that they would come in and say, oh, you know, I'm feeling very tired, I have some tightness in the breast and the chest, I've got some tingling down an arm. But, you know, I'm just going to go sit over here. You, oh, doctor, you look very busy, and you know, I'm just feeling tired. I'm just not myself. So I'm just going to sit over here, and you get to someone else while I sit here. When you have time, you can come and talk to me. That was a very gendered presentation of a woman saying, I'm not important enough. So, you know, you go take what you need. And so there was both the sex and the gendered part of cardiovascular mortality in the United States. But, you know, we still don't do, even in this area where we are confident of the sex differences, we still don't do research that really is going to allow us to understand better that arterial plaque development in the small vessel in a versus large vessel. And I think this is hampering, ultimately, the health of all of us. So at Northwestern, we've tried to increase sex and gender research and discussion at the bench, as well as a part of medicine. We have an Institute for Women's Health Research, and we have an Illinois Women's Health Registry, which is a way to try and bring women into the clinical environment. And it's a non-disease database that has about 7,000 participants that are part of all of these trials. And it's not that these trials are just about women. They are broad-based, participant-based trials. But what we try to do, since we can provide to the clinical trial units large numbers of women who fit this demographic, we can insist that they do the sex-based analysis, which is really important for hearing loss or depression or arthritis or for insomnia. And so that's one of the things that we've tried to do. So do we have a men's health registry, which I think is exactly the question you should be asking in your head right now. We do have it, but it hasn't been deployed. And part of that is the financial side, where I said earlier the cost issue. And on this topic, it's that the Dean's office has not yet funded this, but that's part of what we would hope we could be able to do eventually. So if anybody here is interested, we are trying to get more people into the Women's Health Registry, and we call this the Paint the State Purple campaign. We have women from all across the state of Illinois, because we think Illinois is a good place where we could improve the overall health of our entire state if we all get together. So what is our message, and how can we really get this out? At the core, we think it's pretty simple, that males and females differ in their experience of health, the diagnosis and treatment of disease, and in the signature signposts of age. And we do think that it's hard for both legislators and scientists, as well as policymakers, and the public to sometimes really boil this down, because we think it's a pejorative. If we say we're different, someone might say, well, that means that one or the other is less than the other or worse than the other, and that's not true. It is that there are differences based on our molecular makeup, our cellular makeup, and our physiological makeup. And so it's been difficult to boil down into one sentence, and how do we get it out? It's tough to generate the political capital. So here's the way I would look at this, and again, this will be framing for our discussion today. Biological differences between men and women affect health, illness, and disease treatment across the lifespan. So an improved understanding of the differences is necessary to improve the health of all people. This is not just about men or women, this is about all of us. And so I think that's an important part of the problem. in Washington, the most important thing is really this economic issue, and it's also true for scientists. And I think the study of sex-based basic biology provides a cost-effective way to increase the quality and ultimately reduce the cost of healthcare. We're really going to stretch every healthcare dollar. As many of you know, the National Institutes of Health were part of the sequester, where 5% of the budget was lost. And this is after 10 years of no gain, so not even our 3% cost of living. So we've been plowing into the earth like a dirigible. And so I think if we actually think about how to be more cost effective as we move these ideas down the pipeline to medical implementation, that actually the investment at the cheaper end of the equation is the best way to do it. And then there's kind of the personal thing. There must be, a woman said this to my colleague at Northwestern, there must be something more than having my baby and waiting for my cancer. So if women's health care is really just relegated to breast cancer and labor and delivery, I think we really sent the wrong message, again, to all of us. I don't think men want that to be about the health of women, nor do all of us the women want to be defined by these two organs. And then I think that means that sex-specific medicine must matter to all of us. And I think sometimes it simply is that the public is uncomfortable with the words sex and gender. They're not quite sure what that means. Are you talking about having sex? No, we're talking about sexual differences and physiology and the way our cells are composed. And so that's an important part of hopefully the education you're getting and how you can ultimately make a difference. So I think we have to get the scientists and clinicians on board. We have to catalog some of the evidence-based disparities to bring visibility to the problem. And eventually we have to calculate the actual loss to human health if we don't address this. There is a price to pay if we decide not to do this. And so that's part of what my message will be. So let's look forward. We are where we are today. And I started with this hypothesis that advances in 21st century medicine requires fundamental knowledge of sex differences at the molecular, cellular, and physiological levels, and that will ensure best practices are developed for all people. And I think that that if we do this, and if you buy that original hypothesis is correct, then my ultimate thesis would be that sex-specific studies matter to each of us and to the health of our nation. I think Northwestern is leading the charge in all of this, and all of you are ultimately part of the solution. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Sarah Rodriguez.
All right, thank you for coming today. And I'm actually a medical historian, so I'm going to kind of go backwards from where Dr. Woodruff left off. Because while Dr. Woodruff spoke of where we are, my interest is on where we've been and how that will lead us, how that led us to where we are now, but also to keep in mind that past for our thinking while we go forward. So like I said, I'm a medical historian, and like Dr. Woodruff, my primary interest is in women's health. My area is in women's reproductive and sexual health. And I'm interested in looking at women's health because it's an excellent frame to look at the uneven process of women's working for authority and autonomy of their selves, and a frame which to view what has constituted a healthy female body. And that's been a very contested site. It's been a very contested site of meaning and control. Who gets to decide what is a healthy body? And that's been a point of contention for a long time. Additionally, by using health as well as the practice of medicine as a frame also gives us a way to look at how definitions of sex and gender have intersected with ideas about race and how we perceive race in this country. So second, I'm interested in intersections of sex, gender, and health as a means to explore bias in science, which Dr. Woodruff did just touch on too. Now, I, like her obviously, but I'm not a bench scientist, fundamentally believe in the scientific process, but I also believe that science is not immune to cultural biases and also priorities and prejudices. And to sort of give a historical example of what these historical biases have been, in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, one of the reasons white middle-class women were told they can't go on to college or even medical school was actually grounded in a physiological belief about their bodies. And the idea was that women couldn't use their brains and their ovaries at the same time. That the brain, the ovaries would sort of cancel each other out, and the ovaries would shrivel up and they would become infertile. Now, that does sound ridiculous to us right now. However, this idea then was a physiologically based one. But then women, not just women, but also some men researchers then later in the 19th century also then used physiological science to sort of point out, okay, you did use research of this, but you obviously had the cultural bias of you wanted middle-class white women to be bearing children. You were using this as a justification for them not having separate careers outside of motherhood. So I give that as an example of the sort of idea of difference. Difference is very important in science, I think, as Dr. Woodruff nicely illustrated. However, historically, difference has been used as a way to sort of separate out, not to include, but rather to exclude and to say you are an other, you are less like us, or you are inferior. And that's one of the things to keep in mind as we kind of think about science and medicine and health going forward as well. So finally, my interest is obviously in this historical tension and how we still see it possibly playing out today. That in the not-so-distant past, medical attention ideas about women's health and women's bodies were often grounded in this cultural bias against women as well as racial and ethnic minorities, that they are not just different as a way to include, but as different as a way to see them as separate and not equal. So while in contemporary discourse an examination of difference is meant to include what Stephen Epstein has termed the difference and inclusion paradigm, this historical tendency has been much more problematic, with difference again meant to not include but actually to marginalize. So that's why I'm sort of interested in this area, and now I'm going to actually talk to you about what I do as a medical historian when I look at things versus what a bench scientist, or how a bench scientist would go about. And I didn't bring slides from what I'm about to talk to you about today, which you guys will probably be happy about when I tell you about what I'm about to talk to you about today. And that is, right, my current research project is actually on the history of episiotomy and episiotomy repair. So if any of you know what that is, I'm going to tell you, and some of you then will be like, I'm so glad she didn't bring slides. So an episiotomy is an incision a physician makes during the second stage of labor in the perineum. And that is to prevent tearing, undue tearing from the baby's head as the baby comes through the vagina. And the idea being, the justification for this procedure was that a jagged tear was actually worse and harder to recover from than a properly made incision would have been. However, I'm just going to add that this actually was later disproved from a 1983 review of the literature, where it became one of those things that physicians repeated so much that it became normative practice. However, it was so repeated so much, but there was actually no empirical evidence to back up that it was actually more effective to make a cut than to allow a tear. However, that being said, episiotomies were started to be performed in the United States with some regularity in the 1920s. That's when more women started to go to the hospital to give birth. By the time it's in the 1950s and 1960s, this procedure had become incredibly common, even routine for some practitioners, meaning they would do it on almost every single woman that they delivered a baby from. Some hospitals report episiotomy rates as high as 85% during the 1950s, with national rates generally exceeding 70% in the decades that followed. Indeed, the standard obstetrician textbook, Williams Obstetrics, described it during these decades as the most common obstetric procedure outside the cutting of the umbilical cord. Importantly, nearly all women were seen as needing this cut. More often than not, an episiotomy was regarded as a procedure that did not necessitate individual indications. So it wasn't like they were looking at individual women saying, okay, she actually needs an episiotomy. It just had become a standard routine practice for physicians to perform. Though many women did not like this procedure, the incision made with scissors cut deeply into the muscle. It was painful, and many believed it made penetrative sexual activity after childbirth more difficult. Many physicians thought it was beneficial. Again, going to the sort of repeated idea that the surgical cut was actually better than a tear, even though it turned out that this was something that was a mantra that they kept repeating as opposed to having any empirical evidence to back it up. So, and moreover, many physicians did not even ask a woman about this. It became so routine part of birth, it was not like that they were getting their permission to make this cut. The repair of this cut then was as common as the cut itself. In some circles, both medical and popular ones, the pediotomy repair is often referred to as a husband's knot or a husband's stitch, to reflect that some obstetricians put an extra stitch when they sewed up the vagina in order to make it tighter for the perceived husband's sexual enjoyment. Gynecology texts in the 1950s and 1960s sometimes note the repair of proper episiotomies performed on certain patients eliminated all of the sexual trouble in marriage. One woman actually recalled having an episiotomy, and while the physician was sewing her back up, they turned to her husband and said, "Well, I put an extra stitch for you." And this woman took it that obviously he was saying he did this for the husband and not for her benefit. So right now, like I said, this is what project I'm starting on, and I'm analyzing episiotomy repairs discussed in standard obstetric books, published medical articles, and with materials from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And I will examine the framing of episiotomy and its repair within medicine from the 1920s until 2006, which is when the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists actually said this should no longer be routinely performed. And if you remember, I said that the article that came out in 1983 that actually said that there is no empirical evidence for some of the reasons given for performing this. So kind of an interesting thing to think about too is why does it take 2 decades for sort of a normative change within the profession to happen, even though there was evidence to say that it shouldn't be performed routinely. But I'm also going to look at how obstetric texts, which are really geared toward largely male during this time physicians, differed from how nursing texts describe this, and nursing historically being a much more female-dominated profession, and how those differed. So this narrative arc, the 1920s until 2006, follows the trajectory of both episiotomy and its repair from its heyday through when it was questioned, both in the 1970s by feminist health activists, as well as, like I said, by then some male physicians who started doing investigations and then actually doing empirical studies to see if this was an effective procedure and finding out if it wasn't as far as a routine procedure was. And then the subsequent decline of using episiotomy as a routine surgical practice within delivery within the last about 10 years. I will also examine sort of popular ideas about this procedure, but finally my underlying interest in this is getting back to the bias in medicine, the androcentric bias in medicine, that this is a fairly unique procedure and that it's done on the female body, but the idea of part of its reason being done is actually for the male body. So, thank you.
All right, so at this point, what we're going to do is kind of open it up for questions that you might have, given that both Dr. Woodruff and Dr. Rodriguez mentioned some of the future, where they see the future of sex, gender, and health in their summaries that they just provided for us. So I'm going to open it up to you guys and kind of walk around and give you a chance to ask any questions that you might have regarding sex, gender, and health. You can base it on what you heard from what Dr. Woodruff said, or you've got questions on episiotomies for Dr. Rodriguez. We can move from there and we can kind of see where the discussion goes. So I'll walk around with the microphone and have you stand, and I'll just kind of walk around. Just stand and say your name and then ask your question.
My name's Zoe, and I think you've already touched on it briefly, but so once the procedure of the cutting has been done for the woman, were there a lot of cases reported of the women having pain when they did have sexual intercourse?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I mean, that's sort of, right, it's an incision, it's a cut, you're always going to have pain following. But yeah, and I think there's reports that typically would be a couple of months following the repair of it. Yeah.
Interesting.
My name is Judd Rankin. Francis Bacon famously said that the role of science is to strap Mother Nature to a board and torture her secrets out of her. Do you think that there's any masculine bias within the scientific method that some of your descriptions are symptomatic of?
So I have to remember my Francis Bacon, who wrote about the scientific method in 1623, and there are 5 principles of the scientific method. You'll probably have to help me remind me of them. The first is that science is heuristic, and that is that every time you get to a conclusion, there is a new vista opened up to you. That is that new problems will present themselves to you as soon as you learn something. This is one of Bacon's great premises of the scientific method. And I recall telling when my mother would say, well, what do you know? How do you know what you're going to do when you go into the lab tomorrow? You know, you just published this paper. What do you know? What are you going to do next? And so I described to her that, in fact, part of the scientific method is that as you learn more, it opens new venues of problems. I don't think there's anything gendered in the heuristic nature of science. The other part, let's see, again, I have to remember consilience is one of the other points, that consilience means that you should be able to learn something today and later something will, if you don't know the answer today, something in the future will come together and you'll be able to answer that question. This is why I love working with a historian on the problems that we're trying to solve, because in fact there has been much consilience in some of the work we've done. In fact, one of my scientific areas is fertility preservation for cancer patients, and Dr. Rodriguez and I worked on a historical precedent for transplanting ovaries back into women, which is now happening to restore fertility to cancer patients. But it actually had its historical antecedents in the 1920s here in Chicago, in fact. And there were some real historical similarities to where the male physician would describe how the woman would want to have these transplants, and some offset, and well, it wasn't me or my ego that wanted to do this, and it was she and her need. And so I would say that in the consilience, and in that particular example, there is some gendered bias in the way sometimes scientific referencing and sometimes the consilience that seems to be derived can sometimes come forward. The third is measurability on it. So consilience may have within it, unlike the other parts of the Bacon method, some human foibles. There's not just an empirical part to that. So then measurability on a universal scale is the third part of the Bacon scientific method. And in that case, what that says is that if I measure something today using the existing technology, and if new technology is built tomorrow, I may be able to refine that measure, but I wouldn't change the outcome. So scientific principles that existed in the past can be continually refined. So Bacon didn't have the knowledge of the kind of technology we would have today. So at some level, I think he's right that there should be a measurability on a universal scale. And if you take that point to simply say that if I measure something with technology today, and someone in Florida or someone in Brazil measures with the same technology, we should all get largely the same results. I think that's right. But using the different methodology, I think that interpretation may be somewhat different. And I'm forgetting the other 2 things that are in the 5 points. Do you recall? So I think measurability would not have a gendered layering. If I could remember the other 2, do you recall what are the other 2? So. In answer to your question, I would say the scientific method as it was set up in 1623 was really meant to try to bring science together, because science at the time was a lot about observation, and observation implicitly had within it bias. And so the best example of that is the homunculus. I think that we may have other examples. The homunculus is the thought that you were observing the fully formed man in the sperm. And this was not only a gendered view, but it was also a religious view. And what Bacon tried to do was to take that ego and the church and I don't think he cared about the sex because it was all male. So I don't think he had any notion of that. But that was why the scientific method was set up. And probably before the end of the next 20 minutes, I'll remember the other 2 points of that, but thank you for that question.
My name is Libby, and I heard you mention about a procedure where you can transfer ovaries back into a woman to preserve fertility. Could you talk a little more about that and how far that research has come along to become reality?
Sure, Libby, thank you very much for that question. So my own research is in the area of fertility preservation for young patients. It's an area that I actually coined the term for this new medical discipline. It's called oncofertility. So we think of cancer as a disease of aging, and it is, but about 10% of women and men have a cancer diagnosis in age younger than 35, which is in the time when they're either imagining creating a family or are building the family size that they hoped for. And so in 2005, there really were no options that were being provided to young women. Men were being offered sperm banking all the way down to pubertal boys. But women and girls with the same hope for surviving their disease were not being offered any fertility interventions. And this is despite the fact that there would be fertility interventions that could have been made available to some women in kind of the traditional in vitro fertilization clinic, but they simply weren't. And their reasons were many, but some of which were oncologists would say, oh, well, she's not married, so surely she's not thinking about that. Or she should only focus on the disease, but of course they weren't saying that to the men. You know, she has time to think about that later, which of course is a falsehood. She's sterilized by many of the treatments of cancer. And so we took on this as a challenge and built a program in oncofertility, which now allows us to, first of all, create the corridors of communication between the oncology and the reproductive endocrinologist, so these cancer patients who do have time to go through hormonal treatment and get eggs or embryos for cryopreservation now have that option. And those women who don't have that option, we bank a piece of their ovary or the whole ovary, and that's stored for their later use. And in fact, there have been 40 now live births from tissue transplant in humans globally. And so this is good news. This says that we're taking this tissue and cryopreserving it in a way that women can use. The bad news is there's been one recurrence of cancer in that cohort of 40. And so that means that, of course, the tissue that comes out before cancer treatment may have the cancer that that person has just fought to overcome. So the research that we're working on is to try and minimize the need to transplant whole tissue and instead mature the individual follicles within the ovary. And the follicle, for those of you who are not in the sciences, it's not the hair follicle, it's the follicle of the ovary that contains the oocyte, single egg, within the center of cells that make estrogen. So that follicle unit is what gets damaged by chemotherapy or radiation. Unlike the hair follicle where there are stem cells, so you can lose your hair, but then it will start coming back, the follicle in the ovary is irreparably lost, and then the patient is sterilized. So I do think that sometimes those oncologists, when they said, oh, well, she can wait to think about that later, is really conflating hair follicle and follicle, thinking that somehow they can be regenerated. So that's the research that we're doing in the lab, and I'm happy to report that in 2005, of course, there were 0 women being transferred into fertility care. And as of this year, just at Northwestern, we have something like 63 sites around the United States. 87% of young men and women who have a fertility-threatening cancer treatment that are in the age range of 40 and younger get a fertility consult at Northwestern. And that's just an example of what you can do if you really think that you need to eliminate the sex and gender biases in healthcare diagnosis, treatment, and delivery. That's the kind of success story that I think we can have across many other areas.
I think probably I can talk about my Hi, my name is Ruth, and one of the things I'd like both of you to comment on, please, is the role of choice. In other words, how do you make an informed choice as a man or a woman? And it kind of sprung from what you were talking about, but also what Dr. Rodriguez was talking about in terms of historically, what kind of perceived choice did women have about their health? And how do you choose a knee, for example, that's appropriate to you, or how do you choose a treatment that's appropriate to you? How has that changed over time, and what are the prospects for now?
So I'll give the short answer, because this is really Dr. Rodriguez's, one of her areas of real expertise. In the oncofertility area, the women weren't even being given the choice. They were being sterilized. And the men were saying, you know, just don't worry about it. In fact, I'll tell you a short vignette and then turn it over to, this is more a case description, but it's very emblematic. A doctor called me on a Friday afternoon with a 16-year-old who had been in his care for 3 weeks and was going to have a bone marrow transplant with whole body radiation on Monday. She came into the office with her parents just for the final check before she would start this treatment. And she asked him, what's going to happen to my menstrual cycle? And he said, oh, well, you won't ever have to worry about that again, thinking that was a good thing. And, so that kind of, I think his attitude was, well, that pesky menstrual cycle, just, you're not going to have to worry about that. And so there is a certain view about women and their body and interventions. And again, Dr. Rodriguez can tell you a lot more about this. Her scholarship is very deep in this area. But for me, the fact that no women were being told that you might be sterilized by this treatment, yet you will likely survive the disease. In pediatrics, we have an 80% survival rate right now. That says the medicine that's been developed by the biomedical community is really having a profound impact on this deadly disease. A cancer diagnosis today in 2013 is not the death sentence it was even 10 years ago. Yet, in the same time, the survivorship was going up so profoundly, doctors were still treating males and females differently as it related to their fertility. Lance Armstrong was told on the day of his diagnosis of a disease that was already metastatic to his brain, his liver, and his lung, that he should go bank his sperm. He had that C death sentence written all over him, and yet he banked his sperm. Women were not being given that same option. In fact, they had to fight against doctors who would tell them not to do this. And so, I think there really is a big issue with the consent process and the information and the thought that women don't really think through all their options as well. Yet we're the ones in many cases making household decisions on a very broad network scale. So I think that's a really important part of this equation, and the fact that we have women now, almost all of them having some fertility intervention says that they wanted this, they just weren't being offered it in the past. I'll tell you that 16-year-old girl, just to finish that story, the doctor told her this, and so the girl said, well, I'm not going through with the procedure, which was dumbfounding to the doctor. So the doctor got on the phone and called me and said, well, I've got this case, and what are you going to do? And I said, well, first of all, you should have talked to her about this 3 weeks ago. But, when you might have been able to do some other intervention. But, if she really has to go to treatment next week, can you get her on a plane to Chicago? And so they did. She and her mom and dad, who were divorcing at the time, these are all very complicated cases, and a boyfriend who really at 16 had no idea why he was on that plane. So that was the gender difference there. And so he was really irrelevant in this story, but he didn't know that. I'm certain of that. So they got into Chicago from Los Angeles on Saturday and then met with the surgical team on Sunday. We changed the surgical schedule on Monday morning, so she got in at 7:30, had a minimally invasive procedure to take out one ovary, which we banked 80% for her later use. She's now 23 probably, is that right? So 22 or 23. And the other 20% came to the lab where we were trying to develop these technologies that I answered a reference to the question just prior to this, that we hope to make that other 80% useful. And so she then went back and had the treatment. So she is sterile today, biologically, but she has banked this tissue that when she's ready can either be transplanted, or in her case probably not, because the likelihood of transferring disease is very high. But she's banking on the fact that we're developing this technology that hopefully will make that tissue useful to her down the line. And she almost didn't get that option unless she said, well, what's going to happen to my menstrual cycle? Her only way of saying, well, I have to have a baby in the future. And the doctor's saying, you don't have to worry about that pesky little thing. And then she's saying, no, I'm not going to go through with this. So, I think it points out a real problem in medicine that we have to be vigilant about, and we have to continue to make sure that we make the arguments that are necessary to make sure women have the choice with their bodies. And mine is an example, and I think the episiotomy is a great example as well.
And I'll just, beyond sort of interesting that the menstruation was a pesky little problem, which is a very interesting sort of thing about it too. But besides the answer to your question, women have had choice in a long time. We know in the late 19th century, for example, that if women wanted a certain procedure, they might doctor shop until they had a doctor agree to have it, same as we would do today, right? We would maybe get a diagnosis and they suggest you go get a second diagnosis or a third possibly, or maybe you might consider different treatment options. women were doing that 100 years ago, 150 years ago as well. There are, of course, some big differences historically from today as now. I mean, there is a lot more access to information. We could argue whether or not sometimes it's good or bad to get on the internet and look up and convince yourself that you've got this very rare unknown disease to almost anybody, that that's what's your problem. But there is a lot more ease of information. But just like then, as in today, women would have gone around and talked to other doctors about if they wanted said procedure. Now, kind of going back to the episiotomy idea, though, there is then this idea, too, of the sort of medical authority, and historically that has been a male medical authority, largely a white male medical authority, and then how much authority that person had, and how much you as a patient are willing to give up to that authority. And for the case of birth, women gave up quite a bit of power and authority by going into the hospital. Now that was a choice that women historically made because it was perceived as being the hospital being a safer place to give birth than at home. And by about the 1960s and 1970s, that was true. When it started, more women, upper middle class and also working class women started going more frequently in the hospital in the 1920s and 1930s, it actually wasn't statistically true. It was actually, you were better off giving birth at home because you were less likely to get sick from getting another disease from someone else in the hospital, essentially. But that was, women still saw it as being, it is safer to have birth in the hospital, and so they gave up some of that autonomy for perceptions and then actuality of having a safer experience in the hospital. And some of that giving up then was, then you weren't always certain about what the doctor was going to be doing to your body giving birth. I mean, that was the white sheet, right? When they would put the white sheet up and giving birth in the 50s and 60s. That wasn't actually for any sort of medical indication. That was to separate the delivery from the woman's body. So that was the reason for putting that up. It was to sort of disassociate this birth with actually a person doing the giving of the birth. It's also one of the reasons they kicked husbands out of the birthing room. And then women and husbands fought to get back in the 1970s, back into the birthing room.
So the fourth Francis Bacon was repeatability. For consilience, heuristic, measurable on a universal scale, repeatability. I'm just missing one.
Hi, my name's Julie. You've talked a lot about the gender study differences and how much the medical community impacts that. I was wondering if you had any thoughts or opinions on how much the insurance community is impacting that, especially with the recent passage of HIPAA.
Yes. We have a lot of opinion on that, and Dr. Rodriguez and I have been on the record on a lot of these opinions. So, ACA was a very important process, and part of it was to get a lot of just the fundamental women's health care that wasn't covered before into the Affordable Care Act. And that took two ways to do it. One was through the IOM for many of the things that we couldn't get through otherwise. And so there was a special working committee that advised HHS in order to get things like contraceptive health care into the Affordable Care Act. And if that hadn't happened, it wouldn't be there, even in the lame form it is right now. So, there's a lot of nuance in sex, gender, and religious control of our body itself. And we can't disengage these things, I think. In my own world of reproduction, insurance and reimbursability for infertility is out of pocket in general. And, that is a really big problem when we come to cancer patients. So upper class white women generally are those who get fertility care because those are the ones who can pay $40,000 to $50,000 to go through infertility treatment. So one of the things that we worked very actively on was on an insurance mandate. And our infertility group worked on that very specifically with scholarly papers on other kinds of insurance reimbursement that happens for restoring function after, in particular, cancer treatment, wigs, for example, or breast reconstruction. We think fertility should be in that category. But fertility is really wrapped up, as again one of our other colleagues says, we're in a really dicey neighborhood. We're in an area that really the ethics and the insurance and reimbursement, they've all been kind of, they circle around kind of a difficult set of topics. So how do we agree on how we want to put ourselves into the future? Do we want that only through a natural way of fertility, or is intervention okay? And what do we think about that when that happens, when biology causes premature failure of fertility versus a doctor giving you a cancer treatment that is going to cause that loss? So we've been working on many of those kinds of angles, and we just have to keep making sure that the topic is at least in the milieu. We have a bill marked up for insurance reimbursement reform for reproductive health, particularly in cancer patients. It has not gone forward because of the difficulties in Congress, but at least it's out there. And in the meantime, we're doing hand-to-hand combat, going to each self-insured group, like Northwestern is a self-insured program. So Northwestern now has that as a reimbursable part of their benefits. But that's a hard, I mean, we can't go to every company, but that's one of the things that we're trying to do.
Other questions? Oh, yeah, one.
Thank you. My name is Nizam Kaiser. I think Dr. Woodruff is doing a wonderful job in our healthcare system, providing all the information and the work and the research to help women. And I have one question for both of you, which is, have science looked at the DNA capability of repairing itself? Because we know that if we have a cut, if we don't do anything with it, it will heal. So there are other areas, for example, episiotomies. It has come into question with you and your research. It does heal, but have you had enough information from women who have gone through it, gave you or information or research that have shown some of that information out there for the public?
Well, I said I was just starting my episiotomy research, but on that, there actually is that, I mean, if you think about it like this paper, if I cut the paper, it's a lot easier to rip the paper more. So actually there's studies showing if you make an incision, the likelihood of tearing actually increases, particularly what's the 3rd degree tear, which is the worst tear you can have in episiotomy. Whereas if you just tear, it's harder to tear paper than it is to cut paper. So think of it that way too. You're less likely to have the most severe tear if you're not cut. Or if you are cut, you are more likely to have the more severe tear. You might continue tearing, in other words. So that's when they actually started looking at sort of empirical data that they found. Which is why then ACOG said this shouldn't be done routinely. This should only be on women who actually individually indicate the need for it. And there still is sometimes a need for an episiotomy. It's not like it should be never performed. However, it should never have been performed 70–80% of the time.
So Nicole, can I give one last word on this? And I was thinking about this when you were talking, and there is a routine tear and repair process that happens in the female body once a month, and that's at ovulation. Ovulation is an autocatalytic, self-destructive destruction of the surface of the ovary to allow the oocyte to come out of that follicle to be ready for fertilization. So once a month, there's a tear and repair. And that tear and repair happens absolutely routinely. And that repair happens over about 15 minutes. And it is one of these processes that I think is one of the most remarkable in all of biology, to allow the egg to go from the inside of the body basically to the outside of the body. And I couldn't help but think in the episiotomy, I'll bet that tear and repair of the vaginal surface is probably a pretty effective way of healing that area, because the tear and the repair of the female body, we do it routinely. And in fact, evolutionarily, probably the tear and the repair of the reproductive tract in the female, many of the enzymes and mechanisms there were co-opted by the tear and the repair in the epithelium. That's not quite as good as the surface epithelium of the ovary, but it's, that's a pretty good analogy. So if that struck me very much as an analogy that physicians should think about, and so anyway, I leave that as one last thought on the topic of tear and repair in the female body.
Any other questions? I'd like to thank both Dr. Woodruff and Dr. Rodriguez for